Hello everybody and welcome to another React tutorial for beginners. In this video, I'm going to be covering something known as state. Now, state is the data that your application is holding and kind of keeping track of. And so in our case here, we're going to be implementing state in our different components. And while the page, our React application, has not been refreshed, this state will stay the same. It will be persistent across our application. However, as soon as we refresh the React application, the state will disappear. And we'll talk all about state in this video, but just understand that state here is kind of temporary. It's stored only in our front end. It is not stored in the back end. If we were talking about truly persistent data, we would want to be storing this data in a database. So it's actually stored in some file right on, file system and can be accessed from anywhere and at any point in time. Here, this is temporary. It's only going to stay persistent and, be the same across our application while our application has not been refreshed. And one small note here as well, the state that is for one client, so one person visiting the website, will not be the same for everybody. So if I have some state on my website and then you go and you visit the website from your computer, you're not going to have the same state as me. This is kind of local, like it's to the client, if that makes sense. It's not a global state. All right, hopefully that's clear. Anyways, let me show you how we can implement state and really what that is. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to erase a bunch of stuff because we're going to rewrite a ton. So I'm going to remove add item. So I need to remove all of the references to it. And this info component we'll keep for now just because it's a class-based component, and we'll look at how to implement state in a class-based component later. Anyways, let's go to app.js. And let me actually make a new component here. And this will be a functional component that's going to have some state. So I'm going to say function, and let's just make this button state. Kind of a weird name, but again, this is just going to be an example that we'll kind of throw away and delete after. This is just to understand how state works. And then what I'm going to do is return in here, and I'm actually going to create two buttons and two text fields. So I'm going to say p, and in here, let's just say, I don't know, title, colon, and then we'll put some title there. We'll have another p tag, and we will say, I don't know, counter, and oops, if I can type this, counter, and then end the tag. And then here we will have some state as well. Now, all of this needs to be wrapped inside of a div. Always forget about that. So let's take this div tag and put it down here. And now let's create two buttons. So I'm going to make an input, or actually a button, like that, and then we'll say slash button, and we'll just say update title, okay? And then we will make another button, and what this one will say is update counter. All right, so there we go. We have now created our button state component. Let's just render this on the screen. So let's go slash button state, and let's see what this looks like. Refresh, and notice we have our title, we have our counter, and we have update title and update counter. And when we click these, it does nothing. So the idea here is that I want to have some state. The state is going to kind of pertain to this title and this counter. And when I press these buttons, I want to update the state. I want to change it. So how do we implement state? Well, there's these things in React called hooks. And what a hook is kind of a function that's provided by React that you can use to, well, hook into and kind of modify its behavior. So you see what I mean in a second, but what we're going to have to do here is import something that allows us to use state. It's actually called useState and is imported from React, not React DOM, just from React. So whenever you want to set up state in a functional component, what you do is you create a constant. So you need to use const, and then you do these square brackets like this, and you define two values. First, you define the actual variable that's going to store your state, and then you define the name of the function that you're going to use to update this state or update this variable. So in this case, I want a title, so I'm going to say title, and then I'm going to say set title like that, and this is going to be equal to useState. Now, inside of useState, you define the default state. So in this case, I'm just going to make it an empty string. So when we start our application, title is going to be equal to an empty string. And if I want to modify title, I use this set title function, and you'll see how that works in 1 minute. Next, I'm going to define my next piece of state, which is the counter. So I'm just going to say count like that. And then I'm going to say set count and make this equal to useState. Now, it's worth noting that you can name these whatever you want. You don't have to make this set count. I could make this whatever, but it's kind of good practice to just have set followed by the name of the state variable that you're actually going to be updating. All right, so now that we have our title and our count, we can use these just like regular variables in JavaScript. So I can implement them here into my kind of render field, and I'll put title like that. And then for the counter, I will put my count. Now for the counter, actually, I need to make the default state 0. That's because this is going to be an integer, and then we will update this integer. So let me refresh the page here and notice the counter is equal to 0 and the title is equal to an empty string. We see nothing. So now what I want to do is make it so that when we press these buttons, we update our state. And whenever you update the state of a component, it tells that component to re-render itself on the screen. So only that component and any of the children components it's rendering, but not the entire application. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But the idea here is that inside of button state, as soon as either of these states are modified, this entire component will re-render itself. So this return statement will kind of rerun again. That doesn't mean that the app component's going to re-render everything that's here. It just means that this individual component is going to re-render everything that it's returning. And so if you have any children components inside of here, all of those will be re-rendered. Now, this is where you can kind of get into performance and efficiency of React components and how you're storing and handling the state. Because if all of your state is being stored inside an upper level component like app, then that means whenever that state is changed, it's going to re-render the entire application, which is obviously going to take longer than just re-rendering one component at a time. So there's advantages and disadvantages. We'll talk about those in much later videos. But for now, just understand when state is updated, the component will automatically re-render itself so that it can show the updated state. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make an on-click kind of handler for both of these buttons. So what you need to do whenever you want to call a JavaScript function when a button is clicked is you need to use onClick. I forget if we've seen this before, if I showed it to you, so I'm just going to re-explain it. What you need to do is pass a function that you want to be called when this button is clicked. So in this case, the function that I want to be called is setTitle and setCount. But I need to call these functions with arguments. Those arguments are going to be what I want to set the title to or set the count to. And so I'm just going to create two functions here. I'm going to say const, and this will say, I don't know, update title clicked like that. And this will be equal to an arrow function like that. I think that's good. Okay, I'm going to copy this. I'm going to make another function, and this will be update and then counter clicked. All right, so now for the onClick, I'm just going to make it equal to these two functions. So I'm going to say update title clicked, and I'm going to say update counter clicked. Now notice I didn't add the parentheses here. This is because I'm just giving the name of the function, and then this button will call the function that I gave it whenever we click it. And anyways, inside of here, what I'm going to do now is set the title and set the count. So I'm going to say set title like that. And then I need to pass what I want to set the title to. So in this case, we'll just hard code something in and we'll say, we now have a title, exclamation point. And then for the counter, I'm going to say set counter. And then we will set this equal to whatever the count previously was plus 1. All right, so let's save this now. And set counter is not defined. Sorry, this is going to be set count, not set counter. And hopefully that will work now. Okay. So now ideally what should happen when we press these buttons is we're going to update the title state. That will cause the component to re-render, and so we should see the updated title. So let's press that, and notice it says we now have a title. And every time I press this, it's going to keep re-rendering the component because we're updating the state. But in this case here, since the state is the same, we don't see anything different, right? Now when I go to update counter, let's press it, we can see the counter goes to 1, and then to 2, and then to 3, and then to 4, and 5, and 6, and so on and so forth. And there you go. That is pretty much how you can deal with state. It's pretty simple. You just define the state variable. You then define the function that you're going to use to update that state. Whenever you want to update the state, you simply call the function with the updated value. And there you go. Whenever you do this, whenever you call one of these functions, it will force React to re-render the component. So anything inside of here will be re-rendered. So we will continue in 1 second, but I need to quickly thank the sponsor of this video and this series, which is AlgoExpert. AlgoExpert is the best platform to use when preparing for your software engineering coding interviews. There's also a product on AlgoExpert called Systems Expert that you can use to prepare for your systems design interviews. Get started on AlgoExpert today by clicking the link in the description and using the code TechWithTim for a discount on the platform. Now what I want to show you though is what happens when we want to pass this state down to components that are different components. So for example, say we have some data components, and maybe that data component or components, whatever they are actually going to show the title and show the count. And from here, we want these buttons to update the title and update the count. And then we want those components to show that updated count. So what I'm going to do is make a new function here. And we're just going to call this data. And this is going to take in some props, because remember, if we want to pass information down to components from one of the upper level components, we can pass that through the props. And here, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to return. We'll do our parentheses here, a div. And we're going to expect that we get 2 props here. So the first prop that I want is going to be the title. And the second prop that I want is going to be the count. So I'm going to say that the title is equal to, and then this will be props.title. And then we'll do another p tag, and we'll say the count is going to be equal to props.count. All right, so there we go. We have a super simple component. And now what we're going to do is just replace this here with that data component. So I'm going to say data, and then we are going to pass in here a title and a count. So I'm going to say title equals, and then I'm going to say title, right? That's my state variable. And then I'm going to say that the count is equal to count. Again, that's my state variable. And there you go. Let's refresh the page here and notice that the count resets and the title resets. Okay, so if I press update title now, you can see this still works. If I press update count, you can see that this still works again. And the reason that this works is because title and count are both state, right? They're then passed in the props to this component. And what happens is whenever you have the state updating, it's re-rendering this entire thing. And so the props here are going to change based on what the state is. And that means we're going to show that in the component. It's going to have those updated values. So hopefully that kind of makes sense, but I just wanted to show you the process of taking state from a component like this and passing it to a component kind of below it in the hierarchy that will then display. And now is a good point to actually look at the React developer tools. So if we go to inspect and we go to components here, you can see that we have kind of the tree hierarchy of the different components that are being rendered. So we have our app component, our info component, we have our button state component, and then our data component. And if we look here, we can see the props are count for title. We now have a title rendered by button state and app. And if we go to button state, we can see we don't have any props, but we have a hook, we have the state, we now have a title and the state for. And there you go. That's kind of a way that you can look at what's actually being passed around to the different components. Okay, so that is kind of the basics of state. Hard to get into any advanced examples right now because, well, we just need to learn about this stuff before we can really start creating our application. What I'm going to do now is show you how we can implement state in our info component. And actually what I'll do here is I will just render the button state component, and inside of the button state component, I will change this to render info. So let's actually, I'm thinking here if this makes sense to do or not. You know what? No. What we're going to do instead is we'll keep info up here, and we'll just add a button or something to info, and it can handle its own state. Okay, so to use state inside of a class-based component is a little bit more complicated than a functional component, but obviously we need to learn how to do that, so let's do that. What I'm going to do inside of info here is I'm going to start by defining what I want to be held in my state. And the way you do this is you say this dot state, and then you make this equal to a JavaScript object. And inside of here, you define your keys, kind of your state values, and then what their default values are going to be. So in this case, for our info component, let's just do the same thing. Let's just have a counter. It's kind of the easiest example to go through. So we'll say count, and by default, this is equal to 0. So that's the only thing that we're going to be storing in our state. And the reason we know that is because we've defined that in the constructor. So you start by defining whatever is going to be stored in your state in the constructor like this. If I wanted another value, maybe like a title, then I would define title and then whatever its default value or starting value is going to be. So let me remove title because I don't want that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is actually just remove all of the stuff that this is rendering. And instead, we'll just quite simply show a p tag that's going to have the count. So we'll say p. We'll say count, colon, and then this will be equal to this dot state dot and then count. And so that is how you access the state. You go this dot state, and then whatever it is from the state that you want to show. In this case, we want to show the count. Now let's remove the props here. We don't need these default props anymore. And now let's see how we can actually update this state. Well, to update this state, we're going to need some type of button or some event that we can use to trigger this. So I'm going to say button and then slash button. I'm going to say click me, exclamation point, and then we need to wrap all of this in a div, and we need to return it. I forgot about that. Okay, so let's say return div. Let's put all of this here inside of the div, and let's remove that semicolon, and now you can see that we have a count and a click me. But obviously when I press click me, nothing is happening. So now what I'm going to do, let's get rid of these. Why is there an empty string showing up here? I don't want that. So now what I'm going to do is do an onClick here. So I'm going to say onClick is equal to, and then we're going to define a function here. We're just going to say, button pressed. So button pressed like that, and then we will put button pressed. All right, so now we will call this function. Notice I had to do a this dot button pressed, and the reason for that is because we're inside of a class-based component, so we have to reference the function with this. Now, actually, I'm realizing I do have to explain something to you about how we kind of call functions from a class-based component. We'll do that in 1 second, but for now, let's update the state. So to update the state inside of a class-based component, you say this dot set state like that, and then inside of here, you pass a JavaScript object with any of the values that you want to update in the state. Now, you do not need to pass every value that's in the state to be able to update them. For example, what I'm going to do here is say count is equal to this dot state dot count plus 1. And then this will update the state. Now, if there was another value in the state here, so if I had like title colon empty string, or I had it equal to a hello or whatever, just because I'm only passing count here doesn't mean that this is going to be kind of removed or not updated or whatever. What happens here is any of the fields that you pass in here are kind of merged with the existing state. And so if you just pass count, it will just update count. Any of the other state values will stay the same. So don't worry about that. There's no need to throw in like a title colon title or something. You don't need to do that. Like React is smart enough to realize that if you're only passing one value, you're only updating one value. And so there's no need to pass anything more than what you want to update. Anyways, hopefully that kind of makes sense, but let's just see what happens here. I'm going to refresh this. And when I press click me, cannot read property set state of undefined. This is interesting. Sorry, this is probably this dot state dot set state. Is that the way you do it? Let's see if that's correct. Cannot read property state of undefined. Okay, so you can see we're getting this error here, and this is what I was talking about like a minute ago, and I said I'm gonna have to explain something to you about creating these kind of functions in the class-based component. What happens by default when I define this function here inside of the class is it does not have access to the this keyword. So to give it access to the this keyword, we need to actually bind it into this class, because right now this is just a function that's defined inside of this class. It doesn't mean it's actually a part of this kind of class instance, and so it can't access this. Now, there's two ways to fix this. The first way is to define an arrow function inside of here like this. So if you simply put the two parentheses, then an arrow, and then you actually manually call this dot button pressed, this will fix the problem for you. Notice if I refresh and I press this, the counter is working totally fine. But if you don't want to do this, you don't want to do this arrow function, then what you can do instead is you can go up to your constructor and you can say this dot button pressed is equal to this dot button pressed dot bind, and then you can pass the this keyword. Now let's see if this works. Now when I press click me, you can see that this works fine. Essentially what we're doing is we're binding the button press to this class. And so now it has access to the this keyword, whereas previously it didn't. Now I recommend you use the other way. So let me just comment this out, where you just do the arrow function. And the reason why the arrow function works is because since this is a function defined inside of the render method, which is already attached to this class, it has access to this keyword. And so then when you call this dot button pressed, it gets access to this keyword as well. That's probably a poor explanation. You don't need to worry about it too much. Just realize that this will then give you access to the this keyword. Anyways, now when I do this and I press this, if I refresh here, what's going on here? This dot button press, sorry, I need to make sure I actually call that function. Okay, let's refresh. You can see that the counter is working totally fine. And notice that the counter here is independent of the counter here, right? And when I press this, it's not updating any of this stuff because the state is only changing inside of this component. Whereas when I press these buttons, it's updating in here and it's not updating up here. Hopefully that makes sense, but that's pretty much what I need to show you relating to state. Kind of the key takeaways here is that state is how we store, persistent information on the web page. As long as you don't refresh, obviously, when you do that, it goes away. And a state is kind of local to a component, but whenever you update a state, it will cause that component to re-render. And that means that any of the stuff that it's rendering will also be re-rendered. To pass state down to children components, like this data component here, you simply pass it through the props. And if you want to update the state of a parent component from a child component, you need to pass something known as a callback. I'll discuss that in a minute. The reason for that is that if we're looking at this kind of data tag, if I try to modify the title inside of here, we get a problem. The reason we would get a problem is because our properties are read-only values. So just remember that. That's why I emphasized that a lot in the last video. When you are passing props through, even if they are state of kind of a upper level component, you cannot directly modify them in the child component. And so to be able to change them from the child component, you actually need to call a function that is contained in the parent component that can then update the state. This is known as a callback. I'll discuss that in the next video when we get into forms and actually working on some components that we're not going to delete afterwards. So hopefully that was a decent summary of state. Hopefully this kind of makes sense. Again, this is how you do it in functional way. This is the way you do it in the class-based way. And in the next video, we'll be talking about forms and events and some kind of real examples. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next React tutorial.